Nisour Square Massacre. On September 16, 2007, Blackwater's tactical support team Raven 23 entered Nisour Square in Baghdad, Iraq, close to the green zone, at around midday when the traffic circle was thick with cars, buses, and the ordinary impatience of a city living under extraordinary pressure. Earlier reports of an explosion near a location connected to a protected U.S. official had pulled the team into motion, and a convoy of 4 armored trucks with heavily armed contractors pushed toward the intersection to secure routes and control the flow. The dangers were not new. By 2007, Baghdad had trained security convoys to treat approaching vehicles as potential suicide car bombs. An escalation of force routines, blocking lanes, hand signals, and warning shots were part of the daily grammar of movement. At the same time, there were widely reported concerns about private security contractors operating aggressively with limited oversight, and Iraqis had grown used to convoys that acted like the road belonged to them. Those risks existed before Raven 23 arrived, and they formed the backdrop for what happened next. Raven 23 took positions and began to lock down the traffic circle, stopping civilian cars in multiple directions. Accounts diverged on the trigger. Some emphasized an approaching civilian vehicle, often described as a white sedan, that did not stop quickly enough. Blackwater's side maintained the team believed it was under threat and acted in self-defense, while Iraqi witnesses and officials maintained the firing began without provocation and that civilians were trapped in the open. But something went wrong in the escalation, and the response did not remain brief or contained. Gunfire expanded into sustained volleys, striking vehicles and people who had nowhere to move, and turning a traffic circle into a closed space where panic and confusion multiplied faster than anyone could communicate. The consequences were immediate and lasting. U.S. prosecutors later described unarmed civilians killed and many more wounded, and the incident became a turning point in Iraqi anger toward private contractors and an international scrutiny of outsourced armed force. Years later came U.S. trials and convictions, followed by appeals and resentencings, and then presidential pardons in late 2020 that reignited outrage and grief. Nisour Square endured in memory as a moment when wartime threat perception met civilian reality at a crowded intersection, and the margin for error collapsed into irreversible loss. Operation Speedy Express. On December 1, 1968, Operation Speedy Express began in South Vietnam's Mekong Delta, heavily focused on Kinh Ha Kien Ho and nearby Canal and Rice Country, where villages sat inside the fight. For 6 months, the 9th Infantry Division drove patrols, night ambushes, and rapid sweeps through paddies and waterways, backed by helicopters, artillery, and frequent airstrikes. About 8,000 troops were committed, and when the enemy could not be fixed in place, firepower often substituted for certainty, rockets, shells, and strafing used to clear suspected positions along dikes, hamlets, and tree lines. In that environment, body count became the scoreboard, pushing units to keep numbers rising even as contacts stayed brief and confusing in the crowded delta. By May 31, 1969, the operation ended with an official claim of more than 10,000 enemy killed, but over 700 weapons recovered, a gap that raised doubts about who was being counted. In Kien Ho, later reports described hospitals treating large numbers of civilians wounded by U.S. firepower during the same period. The controversy built over time. In 1970, an anonymous soldier wrote senior commanders describing repeated killings driven by body count pressure, and by 1972, an Army Inspector General assessment judged civilian casualties substantial, plausibly in the thousands. Tiger Force authorities. In 1967, Tiger Force entered the rice paddies near the Song Vi Valley in Cung Thi Province, South Vietnam, moving in a loose file along the edge of a river and the rise of nearby hills. In that narrow space, a group of elderly farmers worked in the field with nowhere to disappear, water on one side, higher ground on the other, and armed men closing the distance between. The assault happened fast. Shots cracked across the paddy, and bodies dropped into the green, some men collapsing face first into the mud, while others tried to freeze in place and become invisible. It was not a firefight in the usual sense. The farmers were not positioned like an enemy unit, and the violence left behind wounded men and the stillness of a field that had been full of motion minutes earlier. In the weeks that followed, the patrol tempo did not ease, and the moral boundary lines did not hold. Tiger Force moved from paddies into hamlets and bunker lines, pressing civilians to relocate, seizing food, burning huts, and treating shelters as threats rather than refuge. What they did not know, at least not in the way history would later make unavoidable, was how quickly a small unit operating far from oversight could start mistaking control for necessity. The pattern described in the case record included grenades thrown into underground bunkers where families hid, detainees and prisoners killed instead of processed, and unarmed villagers shot during sweeps. As summer pushed toward the fall, the violence was no longer a single episode with a beginning and end. It became a repeated method, something carried from one patrol to the next, as if it were part of the mission's routine. Years later, the Army's Criminal Investigation Command opened a long inquiry, gathered hundreds of sworn statements, and still the case closed without court-martial prosecutions, citing the age of the allegations, evidentiary limits, jurisdiction over former soldiers, and statutes of limitations. For many offenses. Decades after that, investigative reporting brought the buried investigation into public view again, and the central question remained the same: how a sequence of acts described as criminal could be examined for years and yet end with responsibility unresolved. Comment Part 2 below and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.